Welcome back everyone. Let's go ahead and talk about none other than the M1 iPad compared to the iPad of last year, which was the iPad Pro 4th generation. Now these two iPads are still extremely great. I'm going to be honest, if you have one or the other, you're going to be perfectly fine with it. I really don't think you're going to see like an insane difference between them. But as always, there's going to be improvements by picking up the next generation. And between these two, these are very solid iPads for sure. Now dimension-wise, you essentially still have the same dimensions between them. So you pretty much have the 11-inch model and the 12.9-inch model. But rather than before, there is, I think, even more differences from the 11-inch model to the 12.9-inch model this year than last year. So that is another pretty big thing to keep in mind. Now I did get the 11-inch model, but the 12.9-inch model, is obviously a bigger model. They both have the same type of screen sizes you can pick from. So kind of decide from there. There's obviously price differences and all of that stuff, but theoretically you can pick up a 4th gen iPad right now cheaper than the M1 iPad. So that's another thing to keep in mind right now, at least in the used market. So if you want to pick up either one of these, I'll link both of these down below. You can get them from there and help support the channel at the same time. Now on the front, they essentially have the same type of screen. Now you have IPS panels, 11-inch. The M1 iPad does have that liquid retina IPS panel, 120 Hz on both. I really don't think you're going to see that big of a difference on those models, but the 12.9-inch model, but you do have a mini LED display on that 12.9-inch iPad. So that may be a big thing to kind of keep in mind. Me personally, I think that's awesome. I'm totally okay with having the 11-inch model with, a high refresh rate too. So both of these work perfectly fine in my opinion, but that is one of the bigger differences is that panel is supposed to be one of the best panels out there. These iPads already have really good panels, so the fact that that's the case is really awesome. Now on the bottom you have USB Type-C ports on both, but you do have the Thunderbolt port on the M1 iPads now. So if you want to go ahead and branch this out to a different display, well, you can do that by using a Thunderbolt cord, and I'm sure most of you already have them by now. So that's a really cool thing as well, and I'm really happy to see that. On the back, they're roughly almost the same thing. Silver backs, obviously, if you get those colors, they feel really good in the hand, flat sides. And that essentially kind of covers it up here. They both look really good. I love them a lot. They both feel almost exactly the same in the hand as well. But we can go ahead and hit on the cameras now. So they're a little bit different on each model that you get. But on the 11-inch model that I bought, dual camera setups with that LiDAR sensor on both, 12 megapixel wide and then a 10 megapixel ultra wide sensor. You do get 4K at 60 on both, which is really cool. And I'm really happy with these cameras. They're very decent. They're almost like an iPhone 11 camera. They're like if an iPhone 11 Pro and an iPhone 12 Pro had a baby. They're like the same camera in my opinion. You have the LiDAR sensor, which is really cool as well. And the back camera on both of these things are very good. I have very few complaints about both of these iPads in my opinion. On the front though, this may be where the bigger difference is. The last year iPad had that 7 megapixel camera. The M1 iPad now has a 12 megapixel camera, but this is an ultra wide sensor. So from the predecessor, you're getting that standard whatever wide angle lens, whatever it is, to a ultra wide sensor now, which is really important. But on top of that, you actually do get some cool features on the front of this camera. You can now actually go ahead and have some face tracking capability now, which we didn't have before. So that is another really cool capability that we have on this iPad. And I think that is an awesome thing at the end of the day. If you wanted to go ahead and have that type of FaceTime capability, and this iPad has it, where the previous iPad didn't have it. So that in and of itself may be a big reason to actually go ahead and improve and update your specific iPad. So that kind of covers up the camera. The M1 iPad is definitely better, but the previous generation is still a very good iPad for sure. Now moving on to the software, this is where things are a little bit different. So before we had that A Fusion, we had that Apple A12Z Bionic chip before. Now we switched over to M1. So I'm gonna say even if they're the same, then that's awesome. The M1 chip is going to outlast the A12Z chip just because it's newer, I'm sure, and I doubt Apple is going to stop supporting this iPad before the A12Z. It doesn't make any sense. So this is what I see happening. The A12Z is probably going to end off, in a couple of years. The M1 chip is at least going to last like 2 years more than the A12Z. We're already at A14, we're about to get at A15, so in terms of longevity, you're going to get a longer supported device from the M1 chip iPad than the previous generation, which was the iPad Pro 4th generation. Now that doesn't mean the iPad Pro 4th generation is outdated. That device is still going to be lasting for a very long time too, but from what I've seen, from what I've heard, it seems like the M1 chip is definitely going to outlast the, A12Z Bionic chip iPad. Even the previous iPad Pro 3rd gen also had an A12 Bionic chip inside of it in some form or fashion. So that's definitely something to keep in mind. So in terms of that, longevity wise, that's kind of what I'm seeing here. On top of this, From what I've seen, you're getting almost the same type of battery life, the same type of battery features from both of these iPads as well, but the battery life is going to be subjective to the chipset, so I'm going to assume that the M1 is probably going to be a little bit more optimized, but since we already had an A12Z before, we're going to see how it goes. I'll let you guys know in a couple of days, but battery sizes are roughly around the same in this case. Now let's go ahead and end it off with the performance. Now, like I mentioned, the iPads, obviously have the M1 chip for the new ones. They range in RAM quite a bit, so you can get an 8 gig of RAM option. That's what the base model starts off with, and they go all the way up to 16 gigs of RAM, which is crazy. And before, on the previous generation, for the 11-inch models, they went from 6 gigs of RAM, but you can get them all the way up to 8 gigs of RAM as well, and I think even more than 12 gigs as well, which is really cool. So in terms of performance, this is what I'm going to tell you, and this is the best way to break it down. If you want the fastest, most up-to-date, the fastest chipset right now, the M1 chip is probably the best way to go. You're going to be getting the faster performance out of these two, but I don't want you guys to think that you have to get that in order to get really good performance. The iPad Pro 4th generation is still a very good performing iPad. You can pick up either one of these, the 4th, even if you wanted to, the 2nd generation iPad Pro is still a very good performing iPad. And I really don't think a lot of people need to go upgrade to the M1 chip iPad just because of the performance. Yes, it's going to be the faster one probably out of the two, and quite possibly it's going to be the faster one for a while until Apple makes the M2 chip, but that doesn't really mean a whole lot. I can tell you the iPad Pro 4th generation is still a very fast iPad. Really, whatever you're going to do with it, it's going to be completely fine. Whether you are a student and you need to use your Apple Pencil to draw things and take notes, and you need to write out papers and all that stuff, the iPad Pro 4th generation is going to be perfectly fine for you. It's not going to be like you can't use it just because of whatever. It's not really too much slower than the M1 chip right now. The M1 chip iPad is extremely fast. There's actually, in my opinion, a little bit more glitches on the M1 iPad right now than the iPad Pro 4th generation, and that mostly has to do because it's a newer chipset and there's less time it's been on, at least for iPad OS, so there's going to be issues there. But regardless, I can tell you the iPad Pro 4th generation is still a very fast iPad. It just so happens that the M1 iPad Pro is the faster one when it comes down to it. So in terms of that essentially kind of covers it up there in terms of the performance segment. Now, to kind of sum up this video and say answer the question, should you go and buy an M1 iPad Pro or should you buy an iPad Pro 4th generation? Well, this is essentially what I'll tell you. I think both these iPads are extremely good iPads. One isn't crazy, worth it more than the other one, but the M1 iPad Pro is the better one when it comes down to it. It's quite obvious. You're going to be getting a much faster iPad, a much more feature-packed iPad, and there's more of a future on the iPad Pro with the M1 chip than the iPad Pro with the A12Z chip, in my opinion. I think both of these are very good options still, but come just a couple of years, we're going to start seeing Apple fully equip these M chips inside, and if you don't have an M1 chip inside your iPad or an M chip inside your iPad, you're going to be a little outdated. So that is a pretty big thing to keep in mind. You're getting, obviously, I think a better screen from what I've heard on the M1 iPad, even though I think they're about the same. You're getting a Thunderbolt port on the M1 iPad, and it's the M1 iPad. I mean, it has that M1 chip, which is probably its biggest feature in my opinion, and you're getting more RAM on some models and a better camera here and there. But I think the iPad Pro 4th generation, if you can get it for cheaper than the M1 iPad, which you can, dude, it's a really good option still. I think that's a very solid iPad for people to pick up, and I would definitely say if it came down to these two, I would rather have the M1 iPad, but if the iPad Pro 4th generation I could find for a really good deal, I would probably snag that up. I still think these M1 iPads and iPads in general are still pretty expensive, but if you can pick one up for the used market for much cheaper, then I think it's a no-brainer, and I would highly recommend it in my opinion. So that essentially pretty much covers it. If you guys have any other questions or if you want to pick up either one of these, like I mentioned, links are down in the description. You can get them from there and help support the channel at the same time. Hit the like button if you guys enjoyed the video, but definitely hit that subscribe button. Every single subscriber that we get really does count, so so much for you guys to hit that. Check out the other links down in the description as well, but more importantly than everything else, I love every single one of you guys. Hopefully I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out till then.